I know I got to be careful not to go too long because I know we're running out of time, but context is everything. In 1991, I was one of the planners and implementers of Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was a major military operation against the Iraqis. It kicked off with I believe, a 44-day strategic air campaign. We started off that air campaign by blowing up every means of communication, meaning we shut down the radios, we shut down the TVs, we shut down everything. We blew up all the bridges, we blew up all the highways, we blew up everything. Electrical generation plants, petroleum plants, fuel, and this went on for 44 days. And we slaughtered the Iraqi people, slaughtered them. It's not a violation of the war. Everything we bombed was a legitimate military target. But the point is, we killed a lot of Iraqi civilians. Now, the reason why I bring that in is Russia engaged in a major military campaign against Ukraine. You know what they didn't do? They didn't shut down cell phone service. They didn't shut down internet connectivity. They didn't shut down the railroads. They didn't shut down the highways. They let the Ukrainian people travel to and fro here and there. They allowed the president of Ukraine to get on video conferences with the United States Congress, with British Parliament, with the European Union, with NATO, video conferences that not only elevated his status as a leader, but generated billions of dollars of military aid that then flowed in, was turned over to the Ukrainian army and killed Russian soldiers. So the military imperative, the military necessity of shutting this down is real, but Russia didn't do it. Why? Because Russia isn't viewing this as a war like we viewed the war against the Iraqis. Russia is viewing this as a special military operation. People make fun of that word, but it's not war, because if it was war, Ukraine would be gone today, eliminated. You wouldn't recognize it. Unfortunately, it's getting that way because the way the Ukrainians have opted to defend means they're putting their military forces in residential areas, and those areas are getting bombed and destroyed and people are dying. But the original Russian approach was a very soft approach. They didn't use Russian doctrine of overwhelming military firepower, artillery that flattens everything, followed by a massed tank attack that runs over everything. That's not what they did. They actually came in with light infantry units up front who tried to negotiate their way through the towns and cities, meet with the elected officials and say, we're not a threat. Just let us go through and do our job. We won't bother you. You can continue to govern the way you want to govern. I believe the Russians were told by their intelligence professionals that they would be well received. The rumors are that Putin has arrested several of these intelligence officials because they got it wrong. And the Russians weren't well received, and the Russians lost a lot of men up front trying to come in soft. But the point is, the Russians have never changed their position, which is they are there not to defeat the Ukrainian people, but to defeat Nazis, to demilitarize, and to bring minimal harm. And we have written orders to this effect. Now, unfortunately, there's been fighting, and we see, there are civilian casualties and there are refugees. That is just one of the horrific realities of war, which is why the United Nations sought to ban war to begin with, and everybody should ensure that the last option is always military action, that we exhaust every venue short of war before we go to war, because war is horrible. War is awful. You don't want to glamorize war. You don't want to legitimize war, but it's happening right now. And we need to understand that the Russians have done everything humanly possible to minimize the damage that's been done to the Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. We see the Russian concern when you talked about it, Joe, about how before the war started, they began the evacuation of civilian populations out of the war zone, which is one of the things you are required to do under the international humanitarian law. That if you are going to wage conflict in an area where there are civilian structures, you have a duty and responsibility to get the civilians the hell out of there before the fighting starts. Because if you don't, then you're using them as de facto human shields. Well, guess who hasn't evacuated the civilians? The Ukrainians. And now we come to the opposite end. The Russians have gone out of their way to treat Ukrainian civilians with respect. What have we learned about the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis? They view anybody who collaborates with the Russians, any one of these mayors who said, yeah, come on in, keep going, we're not going to harass you, they are now collaborators who will be killed. And they are being killed. They're being arrested and assassinated by the Ukrainian government for the crime of collaboration. They're doing the same thing with people who receive Russian humanitarian aid. The Russians hand out these aid packets that are in little green boxes. They have a white star. You may have seen them. They say Voyamtorg military store, but they hand them out their dry rations, and they give them to people who are hungry, who are starving. It is a crime to possess one of these. If you possess one of these and the Ukrainian National Police catch you, you are treated as a collaborator and you are killed. And this becomes important when we start talking about Bucha in a minute. But as this war goes on, too, we're seeing another thing: the displacement of people. People tend to run away from combat zones because most people are rational thinking people and they don't want to be around where shells are going off. So they flee, and they try to flee out of the combat zone, which means now millions of people are fleeing into Europe, into Poland, into Hungary, into Slovakia, into Romania, Moldova. They're fleeing there, and this creates a crisis of its own. And you talked about Article 4. You know, one of the big things about NATO, people talk about collective defense. An attack against one is an attack against all. That's Article 5. It only be invoked once, right after 9/11, and pretty much what was a propaganda show by the United States to show that the world was lined up behind it. They flew some airplanes over the United States for airborne warning, as if the terrorists were going to hijack even more aircraft, and they sailed some ships in the Mediterranean, but it wasn't real. But NATO's been at war many times. The other article that authorized NATO to go to war is Article 4, and that's basically where the members can consult with one another on matters of imminent security concern of one or more members. They've used that excuse to take on Serbia, to go into Libya, to go into Iraq after the invasion, to go into Afghanistan. And today they've convened Article 4. Poland and the Baltic nations have convened an Article 4 consultation, and they're talking about what can we do in Ukraine. NATO recognizes that if they send military troops into Ukraine, they lose Article 5 protection. So meaning that if Russia responds, you can't gin up the whole NATO group under Article 5, but you can gin them up under Article 4. And that's the danger. Right now, there's active discussions in NATO about creating a humanitarian buffer in Western Ukraine so that these refugees don't come into Europe proper. They're held in place in Western Ukraine, but they need to be protected, so NATO troops will come in. Initially, people said, well, that's insane, because if we do that, the Russians are going to attack, and now we're finding ourselves where two nuclear-armed opponents are facing off against each other at a time when they're both talking about using nuclear weapons. So there's been a lot of hesitation about getting people involved. But as this war progresses, and I believe it's going to get far worse before it gets better, there's going to be even more humanitarian pressure on Europe in the form of this wave of refugees, and there will be more pressure on Europe to do something about it, to include putting a buffer zone in that could lead to force-on-force conflict with Russians. But now we come to Bucha. Bucha was occupied by the Russians. The Russians, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Russia's been perfect. My experience in the military is no military is perfect, because it's composed of human beings who are subjected to some of the most horrific things in the world. Man killing man, or woman killing man, whatever. Human killing a human in a combat situation is murder. It's organized murder of the worst sort, and it's not easy to do. It's not something, and it's good that it's not easy to do, but when you get into a combat mode, and I speak of personal experience, you dehumanize the enemy because you go insane if you viewed them as human beings. So you dehumanize them to the point that you can kill them without thinking, without remorse. And if the second you lose that edge, you die, because the other guy hasn't. He's going to kill you. And when you get that way, you need discipline and you need leadership to be watching your men and women very closely to make sure they don't go over the edge. And it's tough. I mean, Michael Hare wrote a book called Dispatches about Vietnam. It's a classic book. It was quoted in Apocalypse Now, but the saying was, charging someone with murder in wartime is like writing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500. It just doesn't make sense, because war is about murder. Well, it's not. It's about murder of other combatants. It's not about murder of civilians. Sometimes civilians die. That's just the horrible reality of it. The modern military math is, generally speaking, in a modern conflict, for every combatant that dies, a civilian dies. So if we're in a war where 100,000 soldiers have died on both sides, you're probably going to have 100,000 dead civilians. That's just the way it works. But not in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the numbers are much higher for combatants killed than civilians killed. The number's still big for civilians, but the ratio is not 1-to-1. The ratio is like 7-to-1. 7 combatants for every single civilian killed. Why? Because the Russians are coming in soft. Even when most of the civilians are dying because the Ukrainians are digging into civilian neighborhoods, forcing the Russians to blow up buildings, put down artillery barrages, etc., killing civilians. But the numbers would be even lower if the Ukrainians obeyed the law of war. The reason why I bring this up is we're talking about mindset. We have one side that says we're trying to preserve human life, and civilian infrastructure. We have the other side that says if you collaborate with the Russians, you will be killed. I mean, it's written down. They've made videos. They talk about it. So now the Russians are in Bucha to withdraw, part of this withdrawal. While they were there for several weeks, the Russian military says we had good relations with the local people. It was peaceful. We traded our dry rations for their dairy products. So they had a system of barter set up. So the citizens of Bucha would give them eggs, milk, cheese, and the Russians would give them the dry rations, the flour, the salt, the sugar, the meat, etc. And this was going on. Then the Russians left. Anybody who engaged in that kind of interaction with the Russians was now viewed as a collaborator. We know this because the Ukrainian National Police have published an announcement that they are going into Bucha on April 1st to carry out a cleansing operation to liquidate the collaborators. All right, this is the exact opposite of the Russian approach, which is we treat everybody with respect and we try not to harm civilians. The Ukrainians are saying, if you cooperate with the Russians, you will die. They have a videotape of a senior political figure announcing on social media to the citizens of Bucha, stay in your homes. The National Police are carrying out a cleansing operation. Do not panic. Stay in your home. She repeats it over and over and over again. Why? Because the police are in the streets gunning people down, kicking in doors of people who are collaborating and killing them. And we know this is more than just a document and a videotape, because in a videotape of a lady speak, because we have videotape of them actually doing it. We have videotape of the Ukrainian police, especially an Azov group, proudly claiming that they're going on a safari. That's an important word, because when we talk about propaganda, how you take the language of one side, flip it and use it again, take your language, flip it and use it against the other guys. It's the Ukrainians who have a special unit. The name of the Ukrainian Special Police Unit that went into Bucha was the Safari Unit. And they were carrying out a safari to cleanse the pro-Russian collaborators. And cleansing means kill, not capture, kill. And they're doing it. And then they go around and they film the dead bodies and they say the Russians did it. Now, there's a couple things about the dead bodies. One, most of them are wearing white armbands, which means that they were telling the Russians, we're on your side. Don't shoot us. All right. 2, near each body is a green dry ration box, which they were carrying when they got killed, and it's on the ground next to them. 3, when they didn't have the armband, it's because the armband had been taken off and used to bind their hands behind their back. These people were murdered, not by the Russians, but by the Ukrainians. And yet that's not the spin that we're getting right now. The spin we're getting is just the opposite. All the forensic data that's available right now strongly suggests that the Ukrainians are responsible for the death of these people in Bucha. There's no doubt about it. The other interesting thing is they're trying to say these bodies died. I don't want to get too graphic here, but I've been around dead bodies. All right. You shoot a body on March 19th and you leave it lying in the street in 50 and 60 degree weather until April 2nd, the body ain't looking like they're looking on TV. Bodies tend to bloat up. The clothing tends to tear because the body swells and then the body bursts, and it's very disgusting. It's gross. It's fetid. It's putrid. It's not what you saw on TV. What you saw on TV were freshly killed human beings. And we have another piece of evidence that more people need to pay attention to. A Mexican journalist gained access to Bucha on the same day that the Ukrainians were declaring this. And he filmed the bodies, fresh blood. He sat there and said, these people are freshly killed. This is fresh blood. Body ain't laying there since March 19th. It has fresh blood. These people were murdered on April 1st by the Ukrainian National Police. And yet we have the President of the United States coming out and saying that this is a war crime perpetrated by the Russians and Vladimir Putin needs to be brought to justice in The Hague. This is a propaganda war unlike anything we've seen in modern times, because it's not just about manufacturing a case for war. This is about an outright lie about murder, which makes us complicit in the crime, us being Americans, because that's our president who's facilitating the crime.